Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog with me, Lowkey. As always, you know we are going against the grain, covering stories which are routinely ignored by the mainstream media. We hope that you can support Mint Press in what we do by donating to the Patreon, by sharing this video, by subscribing, by liking, by commenting. As you will know, we are up against quite a sophisticated form of shadow banning. And of course, algorithmically, we know that stories that go against the grain in this way are often suppressed on these massive big tech platforms, which are in many ways embedded with the military industrial complex. Now, this week we have a guest who, as a part of Empire Files, has really contributed massively to giving people a deeper and more in-depth understanding of the very centers of power which dominate so much of our lives. She is an activist, a filmmaker, essentially a storyteller and a communicator. We are joined this week by the brilliant Abby Martin. Abby, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to talk to you, Lowkey.
No, it's an honor to have you here. And, you know, the work that you and Mike do is really something extremely, extremely special. Now, you, in the midst of the COP26 sort of propaganda bonanza, where we got to see the elites of the world queuing up to virtue signal about how much they cared about the future of humanity, you released a video which really cut through the BS. As we know, military emissions were off the table in the negotiations for COP26. We know that the US military pollutes more than 140 countries. And you put the question directly to Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that great icon of Democrats' extreme centrism, essentially. You asked her directly, how could we in any way be expected to be taking on this issue when leaving military emissions off the table? Now, her response was, the way I see it, quite almost robotic. And it wasn't obviously just Nancy Pelosi. It was also another member of Congress who attempted to answer your question, Frank Pallone. Now, when you went in there with the idea that you were going to ask this question, what did you expect the answer to be like? And were you surprised by quite how flaccid the response was?
Well, just the day prior to that, first, let me give some context about what COP26 is. It's the 26th annual convention of most global leaders who are kind of junior collaborators with the US empire. So, of course, big competitors like China and Russia are not invited to have a seat at the table. But it's essentially all of these countries getting together to pat themselves on the back and to set these standards for themselves that are essentially impossible to even reach. Because as you mentioned, Lowkey, ever since the Kyoto Treaty in 1997, the US empire has lobbied this convening annual body to exclude not only US military emissions, but all countries' military emissions, because of course the US sets the way, it sets the precedent. So no one actually documents how many emissions that their military is contributing to the climate problem. And so what it was essentially was basically a giant trade show. You had all of these countries heralding themselves as pioneers of innovation, as alternative energy partners, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE. It was quite fascinating to see what countries were up there with these huge booths. Of course, the numbers came out from, I think, Global Witness that showed that 500 oil and gas lobbyists were present there, representing the largest delegation of any country. So going in there, I kind of knew that it was a farce. Of course, I knew that no one was going to be addressing the elephant in the room. And it was just panel after panel of virtue signaling and kind of woke washing, essentially talking about how we need to put Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices front and center while never talking about the roots of systemic oppression, racist oppression, class oppression. So it was quite insulting, actually, as a whole. And then, of course, this concept of net zero. I mean, basically, the main takeaway from the conference was we are not doing anything to really limit fossil fuel emissions. I mean, to basically stop extracting oil from the ground. Instead, we're just going to offset however many emissions we put out in the earth. We're just going to maybe plant a few trees or do some sort of net zero carbon offset. It's a complete farce. So the day before I confronted Nancy Pelosi, I actually was in a room talking to the 4 alleged climate pioneers, the governors of Washington, Hawaii, Oregon, and man, I forget the 4th state, but basically Jay Inslee, who ran as the climate candidate in the 2020 election, was the one who I posed the question to after they talked about how we need to subsidize electric car companies and give, old electric cars to lower class people, and somehow that's the solution to the climate crisis we're facing, as we're facing down cataclysmic changes within the next decade or so. Like, it's just fascinating, the disconnect with these people. But so this guy was supposedly the pioneer, the leading voice of climate change action during the election. And so I thought it was a no-brainer, right, to ask him quite directly about the same thing that I asked Nancy Pelosi. Do you agree that the military should be excluded? And he just went on and on and on, basically about how the military needs to be a force for innovation. So the military is actually good. It's going to lead the way to fight climate change. And then, of course, after the conference was over, I went up to him again and point blank, I was just like, do you agree? Yes or no? Why is it so hard to answer a direct question? And he just sidestepped the issue. And so did all of the governors, Oregon, Hawaii, down the line, Illinois, excuse me, that was the 4th state. And none of them would answer the question. All of them congratulated the military and actually said that the military is the solution, Lowkey. So having that happen the day before, I had a pretty bad feeling about what was going to happen the following day. So I knew very well what kind of answers were going to be delivered to me, especially from someone like Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi has been a gatekeeper for any sort of progressive left action my entire adult life. Wow. I remember back during 2004 when the Bush administration's crimes were put out on full display by Dennis Kucinich, and he bravely introduced these articles of impeachment. And Nancy Pelosi was just like, it is off the table. Impeachment for torture, starting illegal wars of aggression. I mean, I'll just never forget that moment. And here we are 20 years later. And this woman is still up there basically blocking and reinforcing the murderous status quo. So going in there, I had no idea that she would even pick on me. This is a huge conference hall full of journalists from the corporate media. But of course, knowing this superficiality and the virtue signaling that she loves to do, and basically that defines the entire Biden administration, I just happen to be one of the only women. And so she preempts, she takes 2 questions from the audience. The first one was from some like Washington Post journalist who she basically was like, oh, Nancy, what are you guys going to think about Build Back Better? Like, just a totally fake throwaway question. And so then she just is like, I want a woman. And so, I'm like, oh my God, this is my chance to get this question asked or answered. And so she picks on me and she's like, maybe I don't. Once I say Abby Martin from the Empire Files. And I was like, okay, do you actually know who I am or not? But it was just like the one time that kind of the identity politics worked in my favor of just being a woman. But Lowkey, her answer just really said it all. It was essentially just, we're going to slap some solar panels on tanks, and that we need the military to lead the way for the inevitability of where we know climate change is going, which is basically mass refugee crisis and global wars. I mean, that's basically what she said in a nutshell, was that we need a strong military to deal with mitigating the worst effects of climate change, meaning people coming in to the country trying to flee their uninhabitable lands. And as you mentioned, a man actually stepped up and tried to answer for her before she actually did answer my question, Frank Pallone, New Jersey congressman. And he basically said, we need a bigger Navy because the oceans are going to rise. I mean, you cannot parody how surreal their answers really were without taking into account the crux of my question, which is the military is not only omitted, but it is one of the largest contributors to the climate change crisis and also global pollution. So this entire conference is meaningless unless we're addressing what the US military is doing and the catastrophic damage to the planet and to the planet's adaptability to deal with climate change in the future.
And also, I've always found it interesting that when looking at the subsidies that go to fossil fuel companies from the US government, that actually it's almost on par with the military budget. When you also look at the revolving door between the fossil fuel companies and those in the US military, and the same here, people in the British military and also in the British intelligence services, there's a clear, very close and incestuous relationship between these organizations and these institutions. The interesting thing to me about the knee-jerk sort of robotic response, whereby you are presenting something and saying this is a major, if not the largest part of the problem when we're talking about this issue of climate change, and they turn around to you and say that this thing that you've presented to them as the problem is actually the solution. And why? Who do they cite? Both of them cite conversations with people from the national security state as evidence for what they're saying.
Abby Martin with the Empire Files. Speaker Pelosi, you just presided over a large increase in the Pentagon budget. This Pentagon budget is already massive. The Pentagon is a larger polluter than 140 countries combined. How can we seriously talk about net zero if there is this bipartisan consensus to constantly expand this large contributor to climate change, which is exempt from these conferences? Military is exempt from climate talks.
Well, I just want to use an example if I can. You know, the sea level rise is an important part of what's happening to the climate. And I am not a defense person, but I've had so many talks with the Defense Department, with the Navy in particular, about how they have to respond to what's going on. So I really do think that there is no reason why what we're putting together, with Build Back Better and other things, can't respond to the Defense Department and have the same impact in terms of reducing emissions. And I do think that the Defense Department is very much aware of the fact that they have to play a major role, both from a strategic as well as, for the good of the world. So I don't see what we're doing in any way, or, increasing the defense budget as being something that's inconsistent with climate action. I really don't.
So it's just a completely anti-intellectual conversation. But also I looked into Frank Pallone and his political action committee. These are the PACs that dominate US politics. Pallone for Congress has been funded yearly by Lockheed Martin, the largest arms company in the world. He is also reported as taking donations from Raytheon Technologies, which is the second largest arms company in the world.
And may I just add that the national security advisors all tell us that the climate crisis is a national security matter. It is, of course, a health matter for our children, the water they drink, the air they breathe, etc. It is a jobs issue between clean technologies being the future of our workforce and the training for all of that. It is a national security issue because of the all of the conditions that climate crisis produces. I won't go into all of them, but they are cause for migration, conflict over habitat and resources, and again, a security challenge globally.
In addition to that, Nancy Pelosi herself, her PAC, PAC to the Future, is actually funded by Lockheed Martin, again, on a yearly basis. You can find that on Lockheed Martin's own website. She's also been funded by Boeing, by Honeywell, which is a company which claims to have hardware in virtually every defense aircraft in the world. That is a direct quote. She has also been funded by Raytheon and General Dynamics. And in fact, one of her long-term staffers, he was working for her for many, many years, took a job with The Group, which is a lobbying firm which works for Lockheed Martin. So essentially, what you were pointing out is that there is an intransigence in our system which cannot respond to certain things. And it has a very small parameter for political choice and political option. And that clip, it really illustrated that so brilliantly. And you've also, on the Empire Files, put out a few films recently that were definitely pushed by the Red Hill crisis and catastrophe, which is affecting US military personnel and also people in, one of the islands of Hawaii. But the question is that I wanted to ask you is, when looking at that macro, because essentially when you're sitting in that room with Nancy Pelosi, you're looking at the macro level of this issue. But then when you're making a film in Hawaii, this is the micro level of the issue and the way that that macro affects the micro. And that's, the brilliant thing about the work that you do at Empire Files, is it confronts the macro with the micro, and it makes clear to people those relationships. Now, tell us a bit about the new films that you've made, and tell us exactly what is the Red Hill crisis.
Right. And, I have to also just add to how bizarre it was to just face down Nancy Pelosi in a room like that, and to have my question be addressed and kind of trivialized, and, AOC actually, at least she was on record saying, yeah, I mean, how are we going to cut carbon emissions by 2050 if we don't even know what we're counting? And I think there was pressure for her to break with the Democratic establishment on that. But you're totally right, Lowkey. I mean, we have an unchanging foreign policy consensus that is completely bipartisan, and it continues to just oversee this massive military expanse, and we cannot confront our environmental problems as long as this huge global empire exists. The new film that we're working on right now is called Earth's Greatest Enemy. And as you say, this is kind of a macro take on the entirety of the problem, from the origins of empire. How did it develop into the massive expanse that we see today, where we're talking about 1,000 bases around the world in over half the world's countries, backing 75% of the world's dictatorships. Every single area where there's a base, there's a dumping ground that surrounds it. There's the removal of the sovereignty of the peoples who are being essentially occupied by the US military. The US military is the largest institutional polluter in the world. There is no corporation or industry that compares to the damage and devastation done by the US war machine. So it makes sense when you look at the 1,000 or so bases, the vehicles, the logistics, the infrastructure that really goes into holding this together. But then it goes so much farther than that. I mean, there's war games, there's the mock invasions of China, there's the munitions testing in places like Guam and Puerto Rico, there's the arms manufacturers, right? There's the supply chain of weaponry, so the production and distribution of weapons. There's the proxy armies and countries that are utilized by the empire that we're not even backing, on paper or whatever, that we're funneling weapons into. All of these things are hidden. And this hidden fact is why the US military's emissions are exempt, of course, because they don't want us to know the enormous cost of US empire to the environment. Red Hill is a perfect example of this, and this is what we're basically trying to do with our new film, called Earth's Greatest Enemy. It's not just about the climate problem; it's about everything, And of course, there's war in general, the decimation of infrastructure, of land, of culture. It's an ecological catastrophe. The callous use of chemicals like Agent Orange and burn pits and depleted uranium. I mean, these things are permanent. Depleted uranium has a shelf life as long as the Earth has been around. So we're talking about permanent disabilities and birth defects because the US wanted more powerful munitions for a couple months or years in somewhere like Fallujah. It is absolutely catastrophic, and it needs to be confronted. And there's a huge problem right now of kind of this disconnect and lapse of understanding in the environmental movement in general. As we face down the more serious effects of climate change, and as tens of millions of people around the world are organizing accordingly to face, oil production and put their bodies on the line to really resist some of this infrastructure that's continuing to drill, I think there's a disconnect with the environmental movement of the role that the US military, the role of empire and imperialism plays in this continuous system. I mean, we're talking about a stage of capitalism that is extractive and that will continue to basically destroy any country that is left independent and not completely subservient to the US empire. And that's why we see this power competition with China. That's why we see the war buildup with the Ukraine and Russia. It's a very dangerous system. And it is not stopping. It is not stopping. And so there's a problem, I think, with the diagnosis. And a lot of discussion is on the environment, rightly so, but there's very little discussion on how the US military plays a role in this. And in fact, it plays, I think, the largest role. And it's the elephant in the room, and it needs to be dragged out of the shadows into the light so we can try to generate a movement to demilitarize. Let's talk about Red Hill, because this is one of thousands, tens of thousands of examples of what the US military does where it goes. Red Hill is a place in Hawaii. It's a fueling station on the top of these beautiful mountain landscapes. And it holds tens of millions of gallons of fuel for the US Navy there. And it is 100 feet. These giant fuel tanks sit just 100 feet above this incredible aquifer that takes essentially years to filter the island's water to its residents. This is not just a man-made dam. This is something that is a cyclical process that's completely natural, that filters this beautiful rainwater through these mountains. So to have hundreds of millions of jet fuel stored just above this natural aquifer just defies logic. But that's exactly what has been happening for decades. I feel like before we get into, the struggle there, I want to just explain some context about what Hawaii is and how it relates to US militarism, because a lot of Americans just kind of peripherally understand Hawaii as this beautiful state that's kind of a tropical vacation. And they don't really understand that a lot of Native Hawaiians still consider Hawaii illegally annexed and illegally occupied by the US military. In fact, in 1895, the US military illegally annexed and illegally seized Hawaii for one of the first expanses of the territorial oceanic empire, where you see tons of territories that are dotted. In fact, the US map of the United States is not just this tidy map that we all understand today. It's actually a much greater expanse of territorial lands that go far beyond just the borders that we understand. Hawaii, of course, is one that has been officiated as a US state against the wishes of Native Hawaiians. It was what they say was a progressive monarchy. And the US Navy basically just wanted a place to refuel and post up their ships. And so that's what they did. They dredged up what was referred to as the breadbasket of the entire chain of islands, Pearl Harbor. It was called something else, of course, back in the day, but it was an incredibly plentiful place, bountiful, full of all of the needs that supplied all of the native residents of the islands. And so the US military comes in and they just dredge it all up, just so they can post up these giant ships and basically pose a threat to Asia and every other country that it was facing down at the time. And what happened is now all of the harbor is toxic. There's signs everywhere saying, do not eat the fish that you fish here. The land is basically considered incredibly toxic. And so that's what happens. I mean, this is just a small example of what happens everywhere that there's a base. They dump and pollute callously, poison their own service members and the surrounding communities. And largely it's just completely, they're completely immunized from any sort of accountability, because especially when we're looking outside the United States, the EPA has no oversight whatsoever at these 800 military bases around the world. So back to Hawaii, though, I mean, Oahu, where Red Hill is hosted, Oahu is actually still occupied by the U.S. military, quite obviously so. Like 25% of the entire island is still under military occupation. So that's how much the military is present there. They not only use Pearl Harbor to, have these giant ships and refuel them, and not only are using the mountain ranges to hold tens of millions of gallons of jet fuel, they're also using parts of the island as munitions testing, military drills, and training. And this is making large swaths of the island completely uninhabitable for the residents. So we're talking about a century of this kind of neo-colonial relationship that the US military has had over Hawaiians. And as soon as they found out about this top secret Red Hill facility back a couple decades ago, all of the residents have been calling to shut it down, because they very well know that once a leak happens, you cannot stop it. You can't just flesh out like an aquifer. That's not how it works. And so they've been calling over and over again, please move the fuel, shut down these tanks, because any small leak can actually have huge impacts on human health and the environment. And that's exactly what we've seen just a couple months ago. We saw a pretty big leak. And we don't know exactly if this was prior to that, because I said this is a cyclical process that actually is years long, that actually filters this water through. So we don't know how many leaks, how severe the leaks have been, but all we know is that a few months ago, residents started to have chemical burns in their mouth, pets were dying in mass, infants had horrific injuries, and the Navy was denying that anything was in the water at all. So until people literally were being rushed to the emergency room after drinking jet fuel laden water for weeks and weeks and being denied that this was happening by the Navy, they weren't even informed that the water was contaminated. They basically had to admit it after so many people were going to the emergency room with chemical burns. I mean, you just can't deny that reality. And so that's exactly what's happening now. There was this huge uproar from Native Hawaiians. Again, it kind of reinvigorated this call to shut down Red Hill. And this is a perfect example of how unaccountable the US military is, and how much the Pentagon really runs our so-called democracy. Because the government of Hawaii, the Board of Water Supply, and basically all the environmental groups there issued like an executive order to shut down these tanks, to move the fuel out of Red Hill. So what happened? They asked for a 30-day basically they gave the Navy 30 days to come up with a plan to take the fuel, to defuel these tanks. And what did the Navy do after those 30 days? They responded with a legal case saying, no, we're actually going to fight this in court. And I think that really shows the impunity and the arrogance, the imperial arrogance of this system, of this institution, that it knows simply it is completely above the law.
Absolutely. And when the decision, or at least the call from the Hawaiian government came to shut down Red Hill, Carlos del Toro, the US Secretary of the Navy, actually said that this was merely a request, and that it wasn't just the fuel that was harming people. This is someone, Carlos del Toro, who founded the arms company SBG Technology Solutions. He was the president and CEO of it for 17 years, of this defense contractor. But then it's thought that he still has equity in this company, despite serving as the Secretary of the Navy. So clearly we are seeing here that the US military machine is willing to poison even its own employees and the people that work for it and serve it, as well as the people around it. We know about depleted uranium, which the US military admits leaving in Hawaii. We also know that they've buried nuclear weapons there. There's also the widespread knowledge of what they called Superfund sites, which is where the land has been contaminated beyond human habitation because of the presence of the US military in different parts of the islands that we know of as Hawaii. But also, you have been engaged in a battle with the state of Georgia over this loyalty oath that you were asked to sign, which would be a sort of pledge that you would never engage in BDS. You were invited to talk at Georgia University, and they said in order to speak there, this is what you had to do, was sign this oath that you would never engage in boycott, divestment, and sanctions on the state of Israel. Now, this case has developed because, of course, you launched a lawsuit against the state of Georgia. And there was recently a decision made in May 2021 regarding this case. Could you tell us about that, please?
Absolutely. So a lot of people might be shocked to learn that over half of the states in this country have these laws on the books. So anti-boycott, divestment, sanctions laws against the state of Israel. I had known about these laws before agreeing to speak at this media literacy concert, but I actually did not know that Georgia had such a law or that it would give me a contract that had this language in it. So I was quite stunned to receive the contract after I was simply invited to give the keynote address at a media literacy conference that had nothing to do with Palestine or Israel. And it was at a state university. And the contract said, a clause in the contract basically said, you can never advocate the BDS movement. And I was taken aback. I mean, I'm a staunch advocate for Palestinian human rights, and my entire professional career has advocated for the boycott of Israel, akin to the boycott of South African apartheid. This is a constitutionally protected right that was recognized by the Supreme Court during the Montgomery bus boycotts. And of course, this is about free speech. This is about the right to politically express ourselves, no matter how distasteful that speech may be to other individuals. That's the entire notion of the First Amendment that is heralded as some sacred right. And, you know, we lionize it in movies and entertainment, but we actually don't care about protecting it, especially the politicians that have signed an oath, basically, that pledge to protect the Constitution as they sign their oath to get into office. And they just flagrantly have violated that with this case. So, of course, I refused to sign the contract. The entire conference was canceled as a result. And I just felt completely hopeless. I didn't know what to do until I spoke to some lawyers, and they were like, look, you have a case and you can really challenge this. So long story short, I launched a lawsuit in conjunction with CARE and the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. And we won, Lowkey. I mean, it took a year, and it was right on the heels of the latest vicious Israeli onslaught in Gaza. And federal district court judge Mark Cohen ruled, I think a week after the last bombs fell into Gaza a couple months ago, that I was correct, that my standing was recognized, that this BDS clause in the contract that I was given was unconstitutional. And it was a huge victory. Of course, it added to the precedent that was set by other lawsuits against these BDS clauses, anti-BDS clauses rather, in Texas and other states. And right away, Georgia lawmakers tried to do something about it. So they tried to actually change the law and amend the law so that it could stay on the books and that Israel could claim a propaganda victory. So let me explain. It's a little confusing. So I had to sign a contract because I was receiving $1,000 honorarium. And what they did at the behest of Israel, Israel asked them to change the law, to amend the law in a blatant act of foreign subversion. An Israeli consulate official actually came into the chambers of the Georgia state legislature, sitting next to a lawmaker herself, and said that they were asked by this Israeli consulate official, they were asked to change the law to make it only applicable to people who are making $100,000. So the person who came with this lawmaker, his name is Harold Hirschberg. He's the director of government and political affairs for the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. And so you can see this woman, Representative Silcox, talking in the Georgia state legislature. And she's just like, I want to briefly introduce Harold Hirschberg. He's here with me from the Israeli consulate. I really appreciate him coming down here with me this morning. And she's like, we had some issues, meaning my lawsuit. And so the Israeli consulate official, as well as a number of people, probably other officials from the Israeli government, asked me to raise the limits of the lawsuit, meaning asked me to change the law, to amend the law so that it only applies to businesses or people who are making $100,000 in the state of Georgia. Absolutely shocking that this happened without a peep from the corporate media that's constantly decrying and bemoaning issues of free speech and censorship against conservatives or college campus speakers, basically espousing racist beliefs. Well, where is the outcry about free speech? This is a classic example of censorship, the black hand of the state coming down and stamping out certain types of political speech, namely pro-Palestine, anti-Israel speech. And so what happened? Just a couple of weeks ago, the Georgia state legislature voted overwhelmingly, I think there was only like 7 nay votes, to amend this law so that my case could be rendered moot in the state of Georgia and that it could be a huge propaganda coup for Israel, because they could just be like, look, we didn't have to change the law. The law is technically still on the books, although it's just window dressing, because if you look at the actual facts, the law is unenforceable and still deemed unconstitutional. So let's say someone comes in like a Roger Waters or a Ben and Jerry's and actually does not want to sign the contract, they still would not be able to be charged with anything because of the precedent that my standing already had. Basically, you can't put a dollar amount on free speech. And so it doesn't matter if we're talking about $1 or $1 million. The principle of what was ruled by the judge still holds. And really what they're trying to do is hold back the tide of justice that they inevitably know is coming, because they know that BDS is mounting. They know the grassroots pressure is manifesting around the world, and they know that's inevitably going to take down the apartheid state of Israel. And so they are grasping desperately. This is a desperate attempt for just that basic victory of propaganda, that Hasbro victory, where they could just say like, no, we've successfully lobbied these legislatures and we won, where the law is technically still in the books, but they know very well that they can't apply it.
Well, we have here a process which seems further behind, but you can see quite clearly the intended trajectory. So, for instance, David Cameron, who previously was a patron of the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, which is the builder of settlements in the West Bank. It is, according to Ilan Pappé, he describes it as famous for its ethnic cleansing. This is an organization whose patrons are also the Prime Minister and the President of Israel. David Cameron, as Prime Minister, attempted to pass legislation that banned local governments, so councils, from partaking in BDS. Now, what has happened since then is it's been wrestled back and forth through the courts. But you have Robert Jenrick, who was housing minister, stating that within a year or two, we should have an absolute ban on BDS here, which would be a great step forward. That is a direct quote from Robert Jenrick. But who is Robert Jenrick? So he describes as a family friend the son of Sami Ofer. Sami Ofer was the richest man in the state of Israel. and found himself on the US sanctions list in around 2007. Now, many wondered, why is Sami Offa on the US sanctions list? It's because his company, Zodiac Maritime, which is a shipping company, had been docking in Iran. Now, when this came out and there was an attempt to discuss it in the Knesset, the Speaker of the Knesset quickly received a note saying this is a sensitive topic which should not be discussed publicly. We then find out when Sami Offa dies in 2011 that his company Zodiac Maritime had not been trading with Iran, quite the opposite. It had been transporting Israeli intelligence agents into Iran to carry out assassinations of civilian scientists. We also know that Zodiac Maritime, this was the company responsible for transporting the agents, some of whom used British passports, to Dubai to carry out the assassination of Mabhouh from Hamas in a hotel in Dubai. So Zodiac Maritime is a front for Israeli intelligence. And after Sami Offa died, his son, his grandson, and his nephew run the organization, which is registered in Britain as a British company. Now, Robert Jenrick claims that this family are family friends of his. This is a direct connection between the former housing minister and Israeli intelligence. In addition to that, Robert Jenrick saw fit to intervene when serving as housing minister into David Miller's case at Bristol University. David Miller, another victim of the Israel lobby and its activities within academia. They succeeded in getting him fired from his job, despite the fact that a Bristol University investigation led by a QC, Queen's Counsel legal expert, had found that there was nothing anti-Semitic about anything that David Miller had said. Yet we saw this direct intervention from a housing minister linked to Israeli intelligence. In addition to that, Michael Gove, the current Minister of Levelling Up in Britain, has been touted as the person to deliver this outlawing of BDS. But a key organization that has lobbied for the outlawing of BDS is the Community Security Trust. Now, when Michael Gove was Education Secretary, he allocated £2 million of public money to the Community Security Trust. But what he didn't say is that simultaneous to making that decision, he was on the board of advisors for the Community Security Trust. So what we have is these entanglements of our political class with what are essentially groups that lobby for the interests of the Israeli state and work and have, as the Board of Deputies has said it's in its own trustees report, a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy and strengthen links with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So this is the campaign to crush this massive movement. And there's many different organizations that are set up with the sole purpose of violating BDS, of propagandizing against the principles of BDS. And that is why your case is so massively important. I really would encourage everyone watching this also to watch the fantastic film on Empire Files, Gaza Fights for Freedom. It brought me to tears today, and I really hope that people are able to take the time to absorb the important information in the film and also come face to face with people who have been so deeply harmed and hurt on a daily basis by this machine. But also, it's important for people to take from your experience with this that we are also targets within this war. Abby, it's been really great to have you. If there's anything else that you would like to say or anything else that you would like to direct the viewers towards, please go ahead.
I love how you're always able to just uncover the underbelly of what's really going on, all of the links and connections, all of the dirty money being exchanged, all the front groups. I always like look at your Twitter and I'm like, damn, dude, your research is on point. Like it's pretty awesome. So that was really crazy to hear. And I'm sure that if I look more into who this Israeli consulate official and the Georgia state legislatures, I'm sure that they all have a lot of money talking, coming from similar sources. I encourage everyone to watch the film Gaza Fights for Freedom because it basically is a great tool for the movement to arm yourself with the truth and to have the confidence in these incontrovertible facts about Israeli war crimes. These are UN recognized, documented war crimes that were egregiously committed against a peaceful protest that continued for a year. And we constantly hear this patronizing, infantilizing talking point that Palestinians need to peacefully protest. Where's the Palestinian Gandhi? They were all sniped dead. There were 200 people that were sniped dead for peacefully protesting. That's where they are. They have been doing it. So it doesn't matter how they protest. If they protest militantly or peacefully, they are gunned down just the same and they are brutalized in the exact same way. And so it's crucial that we understand how to combat these talking points and also not be on the defense that, expressing solidarity for Palestinians. No, that doesn't mean that we're anti-Semitic. It means that you are an apologist for apartheid. If you are defending this apartheid regime, and if you're defending war crimes and occupation that's illegal, this illegal police state military occupation, you're the apologist for war crimes. You're the apologist for apartheid. So as anti-racists, of course, it's extremely offensive to be labeled as a bigot or an anti-Semite. It's horrific. And that's why I feel like a lot of us have been so desperate to try to explain why that's not what Palestinian human rights solidarity means. But the tide has changed. The consciousness is completely shifted now, where I think for the last 20 years, it's completely obvious to the world that Israel's not acting with any self-defense in mind. It is an offensive military that is constantly colonizing. Every single day, it's predicated on the expansion and colonization and ethnic cleansing of the indigenous inhabitants. And that's been exactly the same way ever since the foundation of Israel. So please watch the film. It's told by Palestinians, and basically it's just intended to humanize the people who have been called terrorists my entire life. Earth's Greatest Enemy, you can check that out. Red Hill is the tip of the iceberg of what is going on the planet. You mentioned Superfund sites. This is also something that we're going to touch upon in the film. Please check it out. We're in the middle of fundraising, and it's a big project because we kind of want this, very, very comprehensive takedown that will be a slam dunk for anyone who watches it. And we really want to reach as many people as possible. We don't want to just preach to the choir. We need to get out of the echo chamber that the algorithms are driving us to and really put this into the mainstream consciousness. Check it out, earthsgreatestenemy.com. Lowkey, thank you so much. Your show is incredible. It's such an honor to talk to you. And I really hope we can do it again sometime.
No, the honor is all mine. And also I remembered something that I think is worthy of note. So at the time when you and CARE were working on this case, or coordinating or cooperating in some way on this case, we now have evidence that the investigative project on terrorism, led by Steve Emerson, had infiltrated CARE. Now, this organization shares funders with the Friends of the IDF. It shares funders with organizations that build settlements. It also shares funders with some of the most well-known Islamophobes in this country, Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins. It also shares funders with the ethnic cleansers of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. But on top of that, it is known to pass information to Israeli intelligence. Now, the question has to be asked, was part of the scope for the project, the investigative project on terrorism's surveillance and infiltration of CARE, your case? because it certainly would have been of interest to the Israeli government, as we have seen very clearly from what you have shown us. In addition to that, on you mentioning this core issue of anti-racism and the attempt to remix and discredit anti-racists as actually racists and develop what is racism, which is Zionism, as somehow a liberation from colonialism, as we see the ridiculous abuse of language that takes place. I, this week, looked into the Ronson Family Foundation. Now, when talking about the David Miller case at Bristol University, just before I forget, it was pushed, the initial complaint, by the Community Security Trust against David Miller. Now, this is an organization which, according to Anthony Learman from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, has had employees and volunteers trained by Israel's external intelligence services. The Community Security Trust is headed by Gerald Ronson. Gerald Ronson, a close supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu, so close to Israeli former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, that when he was Prime Minister, he called Ronson in prison. Ronson not only backs the Community Security Trust to the hilt and pushes that organization and heads it, but he also funds Bristol University, the university which eventually decided to fire David Miller following a complaint from the Community Security Trust. Not only does he fund it, he's actually considered part of the Vice Chancellor's circle. That is an existing definition within the Bristol University. So it's a very close relationship. This is information that we were not completely aware of previously. In addition to this issue of disguising racism as anti-racism, I also, looking through the Ronson Family Foundation's files, tax filings, found that according to their tax filings, they funded an anti-racist charity in this country by the name of Hope Not Hate in 2020 with £320,000. Now remember, Gerald Ronson was formerly a board member of BICOM, which is an Israel lobby group. This is clearly an Israel lobbyist. But yet here he is funding an organization which claims to be anti-racist, which has never taken any stand with the Palestinians whatsoever, and also on top of that is funded by the Home Office's counterterrorism unit. So here we see the ways in which agency can disguise itself and people can be coerced in quite subtle ways. So Abby, thank you for bearing with that tangent. I just thought it was important to get some of that information out. It's been great hosting you today, and I look forward to more brilliant work from Empire Files going forward. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. Peace out.
Peace.